Now we're going to shift our focus and start looking at independent samples. Remember, for paired and independent, we first have to make that decision by looking how the sampling was done. Is there this relationship that's going on between how our two samples were chosen or not? Recall, we also assume that they are independent until we know otherwise. So how are things going to change when we work with independent samples? Well, we're going to first start by looking at the confidence interval for independent samples. So we're going to have 3 conditions, just as we've seen before. The main difference you see in the first condition here is that instead of random dependent samples, we have random independent samples. So we're still going to make sure that they are independent and still have the idea of random sampling showing up. In the second condition, the main difference here is that since they truly are 2 separate samples, we're going to look at them separately and make sure that they're either both normal or have at least a sample size of 30. And then finally, just as before, our population standard deviation will be unknown. I will have sample standard deviations, but the idea again of having that population standard deviation being unknown is telling me I'm going to end up using that t distribution again. Now for the formula, if we look through this, it's going to be mostly numbers you already know. So we have our 2 individual sample means, our 2 individual sample standard deviations, though notice they are squared here, our 2 individual sample sizes, and then our t. So almost all those just come from the sample. Again, where does t come from? It comes from your level of confidence, so your 95% versus 99%, and we need degrees of freedom. Up until now, the degrees of freedom has been a very easy calculation in just being our sample size minus 1. Unfortunately, it's not so easy anymore, and I'm not going to expect you to use any formula to calculate it. Instead, we can get that number from StatCrunch to help us out. We're also not going to do this whole thing by hand. I'm going to show you how to utilize StatCrunch output to help you get the pieces that you need. But when it comes to our last step, where we need to interpret it, the same ideas that we talked about with dependent or paired samples apply here. Because again, we're still going to be looking for the difference in means. And so looking to see if it's positive, negative, or includes 0 is going to tell me something important. And so as we dive into our next example in the video, be paying close attention to the idea of positive and negative numbers.